Picture this, it's the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The world is in the grip of rapid industrialization and colonial expansion. But within this era of progress exists a dark and disturbing spectacle that many would prefer to forget. I'm talking about the era of human zoos, a display that would shock the conscience of humanity and stain the chronicles of history with its racism and cruelty. In these human zoos exhibitions, living people of color were displayed for the enjoyment of white audiences. Those attractions, which were being visited by millions of Europeans from all corners of the world, ranged from small circus acts and freak shows to giant world fairs held in major cities across the world. These human zoos helped to spread theories of white superiority and racist beliefs that continue to this day. Because of these zoos, Europeans were given the impression that Africans are wild, that they run around naked, that they are not civilized as white people. Because of the human zoos, Africans were often labeled savages by the Europeans that would travel from far and wide to gawk at them. This is a painful part of African history, but many people have never heard of it, and it needs to be told. So, how did it all begin? Well, it goes back to the time of imperialism when European countries were busy taking over and colonizing huge parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The so-called civilized nations of Europe thought they were more advanced and better than the indigenous people they met during their colonial missions. They felt it was their responsibility to bring civilization to what they considered primitive societies across the globe. And how did they plan to do it? Hold on to your seats, because it gets bizarre. These civilized nations of Europe thought it was a brilliant idea to display human beings from colonized lands in what they called human zoos, or ethnological exhibitions. These weren't your ordinary zoos with animals, they were majestic events where people were paraded like exotic zoo animals, all for the entertainment of mainly white audiences. These exhibitions were organized by colonial governments, scientific institutions, and even private entrepreneurs, who sought to satisfy the curiosity of the public hungry for entertainment. You're probably wondering, why would they do such a thing? Back then, people were eager to explore and learn about humans from distant lands. You see, before the days of television, color photography, and Instagram, it was their only way to catch a glimpse of people from colonized or non-European regions. Think of people from Africa, Pacific Islands, and beyond. These exhibitions were their version of reality TV, except, with actual reality. In these shocking exhibits, people were put on display, usually in fake tribal setups or recreated nature scenes. European spectators would stare and laugh at them, treating them like objects to be examined or oddities to be amazed by, all without considering their dignity or humanity. The human zoos became huge hits, attracting big crowds and making tons of money for the people running them. So, whose bright idea was it to display Africans and other races such as the Inuit, Samoan, and Sami people in human zoos for the first time? The first major ethnological exposition or human zoo was organized in 1874 by a guy known as Carl Hagenbeck. Hagenbeck was actually a merchant that specialized in wild animals from Hamburg. Hagenbeck's ultimate dream was to establish his very own zoo. He thought, why not spice things up and include exotic people as well? So, he took his concept of zoos to a whole new level by adding humans to the mix, turning them into spectacles for the amusement of white crowds. After spending time at these zoos, Europeans started seeing Africans as nothing more than uneducated savages. By 1876, Hagenbeck's idea had caught fire, so much so that he began sending his associates to African regions like the Kingdom of Kush, present-day Sudan, to forcefully bring back some wild beasts and, of course, Nubian people for display. Hagenbeck's first Nubian exhibit was such a smash hit in Europe that it toured Paris, London, and Berlin. Today's musicians and artists can only dream of such an opportunity. As time went by and photography became more and more accessible, the appeal of Hagenbeck's exhibit started to decrease. People could now capture images of distant lands and cultures with their cameras, making the staged spectacles of human zoos seem less authentic and more outdated. Hagenbeck staged his last show of human zoos in 1931. But by then the damage was done. Europe had already caught the human zoo bug, and the concept spread like wildfire across the continent. Alright, let's talk about some of the most popular human zoos across Europe. 1. The Human Zoo of Tervuren in 1897. One that really stood out was the Tervuren Human Zoo, which opened its gates in 1897. Before we dive into the Human Zoo of Tervuren, it's important to briefly mention King Leopold. Belgium was big on organizing degrading human shows, and whenever Belgium comes up, King Leopold's name isn't far behind. Now, King Leopold was quite the character, and by character, I mean he's not exactly winning any popularity contests in the history books. King Leopold, who ruled over what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo for much of his reign, which lasted from 1865 to 1909, enslaved the Congolese population. He forced the people there to produce rubber for his personal profit, a process in which hundreds of thousands, if not millions, were killed and mutilated. Exhibitions were more than just a spectacle for Leopold. They were a way to sway Belgians into supporting colonization and to fund his grand schemes to modernize the kingdom. And the biggest opportunity for exhibiting exotic humans came for King Leopold in 1897 thanks to the Brussels International Exposition. The Brussels International Exposition of 1897 was an international fair that was held in Brussels, Belgium, from the 10th of May, 1897 through the 8th of November, 1897. The Brussels International Exposition was massive, spread across 2 sites and containing 14 sections. It was a pretty big deal. The main grounds of the fair were located in the Parc du Cinquantenaire, the first section of the exhibition. On the other hand, the Tervuren section, hosted in the Palace of the Colonies, included a colonial section devoted to the Congo Free State, the personal property of King Leopold II. In Tervuren Park, they set up 3 fenced villages. As I mentioned, King Leopold saw this village section as a way to promote his colonial agenda, using it as a tool to attract investors and sway the Belgian public to support his endeavors. To do that, he needed natives from Congo, and he wasn't asking nicely. A total of 267 Congolese men, women, and children were forced to come and occupy these villages. These Congolese people were displayed behind fences and barriers, sometimes half naked, dressed in animal skins, and performing degrading activities. 90 soldiers from the Force Publique were also among those sent to Belgium for the exhibitions. The Force Publique was an armed force made up only of natives that would perform police and army functions for the Congo Free State. During the exhibitions, they were made to perform in concerts and parades for the public. In the park was a 4th village where educated and civilized young Congolese people were displayed. The whole idea behind this 4th village was to prove that the colonized people could be educated and civilized. You know, like a giant advert trying to show off King Leopold's supposed civilizing efforts. To make things even sadder, what many people might not realize is that the summer of 1897 turned out to be cold and damp. Kept in deplorable conditions, many of the Congolese fell ill. Tragically, 7 of them didn't make it through their forced stay in Belgium. After they passed away, the local cemetery refused to bury them. Instead of a proper burial, they were laid to rest in unconsecrated ground, meant for those considered unfit for a regular burial. It wasn't until 1953 that their remains were finally moved to a burial site in the courtyard of the Catholic Church of St. John the Evangelist in Tervuren. Today, you'll find their graves in St. John the Evangelist in Tervuren. Every year, a day of remembrance is organized to honor the memory of these 7 people. Despite the deaths of 7 people, the Tervuren colonial section was deemed a success. It attracted over 1 million visitors by the end of the exhibition, with daily crowds sometimes reaching 40,000. The exhibition was such a hit that in 1898, the Colonial Palace became a permanent Congo museum. After seeing how well the 1897 Brussels International Exposition went, they decided to do it all over again for Expo 98 in Brussels. This time, they built yet another Congolese village to show off. The area for the Congo exhibit was huge. Belgium wanted to show off its achievements and why it thought it should keep controlling Congo, especially when people were starting to talk about independence. This time around, over 600 Congolese people were, again forcefully brought to Belgium for Expo 58. Unfortunately, one of them, a baby named Just Bonaventure Langa, died during the expo. His cause of death remains a mystery, but he's also buried in the Tervuren cemetery. Now, let's explore another appalling human zoo, but this time, we're crossing over to the United States. You heard that right. Human zoos were not just a European thing, North America had its own. One of the most infamous human zoos occurred during the St. Louis World Fair in 1904. The fair, held in Missouri, was like other world fairs of its time, part entertainment, part promotion for products and industries. So, picture this, you've got this fancy world fair in St. Louis with all its grand neoclassical buildings, a towering Ferris wheel that reaches the sky, and the latest inventions like the X-ray machine and the ice cream cone making their big debut. But behind all the glitz and glamour, there's a not-so-bright side to this picture-perfect scene. Organizers imported thousands of indigenous peoples from around the world to be put on public display, King Leopold style. And unlike circus shows, the human zoo at St. Louis was created with the cooperation of America's scientific society, with approval from government officials. The mastermind behind this spectacle in St. Louis was none other than anthropologist William McGee, one of the most influential people in the scientific world at the time. McGee had quite the resume, he'd even been the acting president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 1903, they tapped him to lead the anthropology department for the World's Fair. His ideas for how to make the fair stand out were right in line with what was considered mainstream anthropology back then. McGee thought he'd enlighten the masses by showcasing what he considered the lower rungs of humanity. You know, ranking civilizations from top to bottom? Many anthropologists like McGee believed Africans were at the bottom of the human ladder, kind of like halfway between orangutans and humans. Top scientists from Harvard and Princeton were really pushing that idea. It just added fuel to the fire that Africans were seen as uncivilized. To make his vision a reality, McGee set up villages to mimic the native habitats of the people he wanted to display. They were fenced in, just like real zoos, to give that full human zoo effect. Over 4 million fairgoers reportedly flocked to these anthropological displays, eagerly staring and poking at the indigenous peoples in their enclosures. Adding insult to injury, native peoples were pressured into participating in athletic contests, all designed to show they were biologically inferior to whites. Those on display were also subjected to experiments in a special laboratory set up by the fair's anthropology department, directed by a psychology professor from Columbia University. The lab conducted tests to measure native people's intelligence, physical features, and even their threshold for pain. If any of the people on display died, their bodies would be studied scientifically. The Smithsonian, for example, had put in a special request for the brains of the deceased so that they could be studied, while the rest of their bodies would be sent to other museums and institutions. Among these people who were subjected to such inhumane treatment were Ainu people from Japan, Patagonians from the Andes, and members of 51 of the First Nations of North America, including Chief Joseph of the massacred Nez Perce, the Comanche soldier Quanah Parker, and the Apache leader Geronimo. To make matters worse, these exhibitions were often arranged by showmen who took groups of unpaid or poorly paid individuals around the world. During the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, among the many tragic tales, one story stood out the most, the story of Ota Benga. On the fairgrounds, Ota Benga lived in a monkey cage, having been sold along with 7 others to American Samuel Verner. Verner had traveled to King Leopold's Congo Free State on behalf of the fair's anthropology department to buy Mbuti pygmies for exhibition. Benga was only around 20 years old when he was sold. Benga was fascinating to look at because he had sharp pointy teeth. Verner told the organizers of the exhibition that the reason for Benga's pointy teeth was because he was a cannibal. But in actual sense, he wasn't. Ota Benga's pointy teeth had a simple explanation, but no one bothered to find out what. You see, human tooth sharpening has always been a part of African culture. This body modification practice was common among people living in the forests of the Congo Basin. This teeth sharpening ritual is also popular among the Makonda people in southeast Tanzania and northern Mozambique. Historically, it was done for spiritual and identification purposes. But the organizers of the fair chose to market Benga as a cannibal so that they could draw in more crowds. So, what did the natives do at the exhibition? Ota Benga and the other enslaved Africans sometimes danced and performed before as many as 20,000 people at a time. After the exhibit ended in early 1905, Samuel Werner returned to Africa to take the pygmies back to their home. However, Ota Benga didn't fit in with the Batwa tribe, where the other pygmies were from. His own tribe had been completely wiped out by the genocide that was ongoing. So, Ota Benga found himself completely alone. Rather than leave him alone in Africa, Werner opted to return with Benga. He boarded the boat back with Werner, and they traveled to New York in the summer of 1906. During that time, William Temple Hornaday, the first director of the New York Zoological Park, which is now known as the Bronx Zoo, offered Ota Benga a job. The job was pretty straightforward. Ota Benga would assist with cleaning the cages, washing the elephants, and other tasks. It made sense since he would be familiar with African animals. However, something unexpected happened. As people saw Ota Benga cleaning the cages and working around the zoo, they became more interested in watching him than the animals. He was often scantily dressed and would sometimes perform alongside the animals, which drew even more attention. It's reported that Mr. Hornaday, noticing the crowd's interest in Ota Benga, had a brilliant idea: why not create an exhibition featuring him? And what better place to showcase him than in a monkey cage? You will be astonished to learn that up to 400,000 people per day visited the zoo just to catch a glimpse of Ota Benga in the monkey cage. Can you imagine what it felt like for poor Ota? Apart from his pointy teeth, why were people so interested in Ota Benga anyway? It's important to consider the context of the time. Back then, the theory of evolution was still a subject of heated debate, not as widely accepted as it is today. People probably flocked to see Ota Benga because they believed, perhaps due to the exhibition's nature, that he was a missing link. That he was a bridge between animals and humans that had never been seen before. They were curious about this idea. It's no surprise that many black people were upset about this. Black ministers and pastors eventually protested, saying it was wrong to treat any human like that. Finally, in 1906, Ota Benga was set free. Ota Benga was sent to Lynchburg, Virginia, where the black community there tried to help him adjust to life as a regular American citizen. Unfortunately, in Lynchburg, he lost hope. Being in Lynchburg wasn't like being home, and the people there weren't his own. Eventually, the loneliness took its toll. He said that he wanted to send his soul back to Africa. One day, it is said that Ota Benga borrowed a gun from one of his host families. He used this gun to shoot himself on the vernal equinox of 1916. And that's how Ota Benga met his tragic end. The world was definitely unkind to him, and the human zoos were a major cause of his suffering. As we conclude, it's hard for people today to believe that human zoos were real, but they were. When you look back at history, even ancient history, and see what humans have done to each other, it's truly cringeworthy. Many human zoos closed down after World War I, partly because survivors integrated into society and couldn't be forced into such conditions anymore. However, subsequent World's Fairs and zoos continued to feature humans as exhibits for decades. While human zoos may seem like relics of the past, the age of racial exploitation has persisted to this day. Even as recently as 2005 in Augsburg, Germany, a celebration of African culture known as the African Village Festival was held, of all places, in the center of the city's zoo. While the organizer saw no issue with this setup, many others understandably took offense. Some were so upset that they even threatened to burn down the zoo. The legacy of human zoos serves as a stark reminder of the dark side of human history. Even though these zoos no longer exist, the scars they left remain. It's a stark lesson about the importance of respecting human dignity and equality, and how what may seem harmless to some can be deeply hurtful to others. Did you know about the history of human zoos before? If not, what are your thoughts on this dark chapter of history? If you have any additional information or insights about the history of human zoos that weren't covered in the videos, please feel free to share. Let's keep digging into lesser-known aspects of African history together. Until next time, keep exploring and learning.